ほら、ルフィ、今一緒に海賊になる仲間を探してるんだ。
Hello guys, welcome to my channel The Wandering Zoro, your go-to destination for anime-related content. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest videos. In today's video, we're going to be diving into part 1 of the series, What If Deku's Soul Gets Reincarnated? So be sure to stick around until the end, and let's get started. I am Izuku Midoriya. And 3 years ago today, I tried to take my own life. I stood by my dear mother who was sitting next to my gravestone. Izu dear, I'm back to visit. She placed a bouquet of beautiful white roses, sighed and looked at the view. It was sunny out, the warm summer wind gently caressing her face. She always wore a tired expression ever since the funeral. Mother, do you hear me? I bent to her level. I wanted so desperately for her to see me. I wanted to tell her that I was okay, that I was at peace. I waved my hand in front of her. No luck. Today's the anniversary of your death, she whispered underneath her breath. She tried her best to hold her tears in. She bit her lip and quickly composed herself. I invited Mitsuki and Katsuki, but they couldn't make it. I hope you don't mind. Of course Kaken couldn't come. He hasn't visited me once. I sighed, laying down on the grass. The rays of sun blinded my ghostly eyes. But of course I couldn't refrain myself from following him around. His life at UA was entertaining. All his friends and classmates, he seems a lot happier now. Izuku, baby, can you hear me? Her voice quivered. She rested her head on my gravestone. Yay, I'm here, Mom, I softly replied. Mommy loves you very much. She looked up to the sky and subtly smiled. I know, Mom, I know that now. I sat up, scooting over to her. I placed my head on her lap and closed my eyes. She too closed her eyes. And for a while things were peaceful. The sounds of birds chirping and busy city buses. I wish this moment could last forever. Today was a day like no other, floating around following Katsuki as usual. His classmates were energetic and noisy. This irritated Kaken. Of course it did. The classroom was filled with laughter and chatter. The homeroom teacher walked in. Shota Aizawa, a sleep-deprived-looking hobo, stood in front of the class clearing his throat. Listen up, Class 1A. The classroom became silent, as expected from the next generation of heroes. For today's hero basic training, it's turned into a class with 3 instructors, All Might, me, and 1 more person. This caught my attention. I raised my head up. All Might began teaching here. Intrigued, I began to pay full attention. Excuse me, what'll we be doing? Raising his hand, a fellow student, Siro, blurted out loud. Aizawa cleared his throat. Disasters, shipwrecks, and everything in between. The classroom broke into a series of whispers. It's rescue training. Aizawa finished his sentence, leaving the students' curiosity to spiral. The training will take place off campus, so we're taking a bus there, Aizawa stated. Heading towards the door, he turned to face the classroom one last time. Start getting ready. And with that, he left the classroom. A few moments of silence went by before the students stood up, leaving the room. I stood there murmuring for a while, soon realizing I was all alone. I quickly followed after Kaken, who was in the locker rooms. The Wanna boys were suiting up into their hero costumes. I watched as Kaken put on the last bit of his suit on, admiring him. I stood there in awe. I'll admit that I was a fan of his costume design. It suits him well. One by one the students lined up, ready to mount the bus. Iida Tenya, the class president, motioned the students into order. The students found their designated seats and soon the bus began moving. I hopped on and sat in an empty seat next to Takoyami, an intimidating individual at first glance. I followed him around enough to know that he is a calm individual. Sometimes he gets the chills when I walk past him. I think he can sense me sometimes. I leaned over to the next row of seats. Bakugo and Kirishima were sitting there. I watched as the two messed around with each other. For the first time, Kaken's expression softened. I sighed, admiring the ray of sunlight hitting both of their faces. I wasn't jealous of their friendship. I was relieved that Bakugo found someone he cared for. I was genuinely happy that he was okay without me. The bus came to a stop. I stuck my head out of the window and my eyes were met with this huge glass dome. I watched in awe. The students did too. Eventually the students got off the bus. We were met with a pro hero standing in front of us. The Space Hero 13, she greeted us. "Everyone, I have been waiting for you." Wide-eyed, I circled around the pro hero. I couldn't believe how close I was standing to her. When I was alive, I would have never gotten a chance like this. Let's not delay any further. Follow me inside. 13 turned around and started walking. The class cheered and followed right behind. Inside the dome was a variety of terrains and natural disaster situations. Just like Aizawa mentioned. Ust contained a shipwreck, a landslide, a fire, a windstorm, etc. 13 stretched her arms out. I created this training ground with different types of rescue scenarios in mind. She turned around to face the class. The unforeseen simulation joint. She breathed, taking in the sight for a few seconds. Or Ust for short. Anyways, let's start. 13. Where's All Might? Aizawa looked around, searching for the symbol of peace, who was nowhere to be seen. He was supposed to meet us here. Aizawa glared at her. 13 paused for a moment. About that. He got caught up in some hero work. 13 glanced at the group of students, then back at Aizawa, lowering her voice. He ran out of time. He's currently resting in the lounge. 13 studied Aizawa's face for some sort of reaction. Aizawa sighed. Well, that's unfortunate. Let's carry on without him. The group of teens groaned. My smile turned upside down. I was looking forward to seeing All Might. Aizawa carried on. Before he could even begin, all eyes were on the center of Aizawa. The students, unsure, ignored Aizawa. "Hey, I'm right here, you know." Aizawa groaned, throwing his arms out. "Aizawa-sensei, is that part of rescue training too?" A student's voice spoke. "What?" Aizawa stood in confusion before turning around to look. A huge purple abyss was expanding. I squinted my eyes to get a better view. I've never seen this type of training before. I watched as Aizawa's expression switched. 13 glanced at Aizawa, then back at the students. A hand reached out of the abyss, revealing a figure. I realized what was going on. This wasn't supposed to be part of the training. This was something unplanned for. My stomach churned. "Everyone gather and stay put," Aizawa ordered the students. The students shuffled closer. 13, protect the students. 13 nodded, standing her ground right behind the confused group of teens. More and more villains started stepping out of the portal. "What is this?" Kirishima said. "It's like the entrance exam. Has the lesson already started?" Some students stepped forward with curiosity. "Don't move," 13 aggressively said, stopping the students in their tracks. "Those are villains." Aizawa put on his yellow goggles. The teens gasped in shock. "But how? Us is secure considering it keeps the press out," I murmured, glancing at Kaken, then back at the villains. Coincidentally, All Might was supposed to be here. Shigaraki Pav. I furrowed my eyebrows. The teachers, there's only 2 of them. I looked at Kurogiri out of the corner of my eye. The teacher's schedule we obtained the other day said that All Might was supposed to be here. Kurogiri shook his head, stepping forward. "We went through all this trouble, bringing a crowd here, and what?" I clenched my fist. "He's not even here." Gritting my teeth, the crowd of villains spread out further into the terrain. I laughed in disbelief. "He's not even here." I raised my arms up, turning to Kurogiri. "I wonder if he'll come if we kill some students." I grinned. "On your mark, Tamura." Izuku Pav. I stood there anxiously, worrying about the safety of the students. Momo spoke up. "Teacher, what about the trespass sensors?" 13 turned to face the worried students. "We have them." "Of course." She hesitated to mutter out those words. The students shuffled worryingly. They must have someone with a quirk who deactivated them. After what felt like an eternity of standing, Todoroki spoke out. A few nodded in agreement. What kind of quirk would that be? By the looks of it, this attack was carefully planned, with a goal in mind, Todoroki added, granting a few gasps. 13. Begin evacuating. Contact the school as soon as possible. Aizawa interrupted the small conversation. 13 sprang into action. Without any moment to spare, Aizawa dashed towards the villains. How was he going to beat all of those guys, with that many? Even if he is capable of erasing quirks, his fighting style is erase then capture. A frontal-style battle would be a challenge. Surely the hero has a trick up his sleeve. I'm leaving it to you, 13. Aizawa instructed before leaving the hero. Aizawa dashed towards the villains who stood in a menacing stance, ready to attack at any moment from any direction. This was dangerous. The villains smirked, doubtful of the hobo's capabilities. After all, it was every villain against him. Gaze hidden by his trusted goggles, he erased the quirk of the villain who was just about to strike out. Hands for guns, fingers capable of shooting out bullets. The villain shook his hands in confusion. Huh, my quirk. The bullets won't come out. The villain pointed and tried again. No luck, not under Aizawa's gaze. This was the perfect distraction. Aizawa struck out with his scarf, wrapping up first group of 3. Secure and snug, the villains squirmed and struggled. There was no escaping from the special fabrics. The surrounding villains exchanged a few glances at each other. You idiots, he's the pro-hero Eraserhead. A villain with a weird face shrieked. From Aizawa's peripheral, a 4-armed man sped towards him. Are you going to erase heteromorphic quirks too? He chuckled, leaping above the hobo's head. An attack from the top was nothing on the hero. Although the villain was right, his erasure quirk was limited. Aizawa cocked back his arms, simply delivering a sucker punch to the face, leaving the villain on the ground. Aizawa dodged multiple attacks coming his way with a few fancy scarf tricks, leaving the villains on the floor. He let out a breath. Something like this was a simple task to do. The masses had no chance against him in hand-to-hand combat. Izuku Pav. The students were now making their move towards the entrance they came from. I followed after, keeping my eyes on the amazing fighting scene. The escape plan was short-lived. Suddenly, the purple abyss appeared in the form of a man, blocking the only exit. I won't let you. The man's demanding voice boomed loud enough for Aizawa to notice. It seemed that he'd let a villain slip away by accident. Nice to meet you. We are the League of Villains. A proper introduction slipped out of the man's mouth. We've slipped here uninvited in order to have All Might, the symbol of peace, take his final breath. Todoroki grunted. His observations were correct. They were after something, a goal to be completed, a reason for chaos and destruction. It seems there has been some kind of change. He isn't present. The portal man spoke, causing tension. 13 began to act with her quirk, her finger pointed on the man. Suddenly, 2 particular students from each side leapt recklessly into action, targeting attacks towards the threat, Katsuki and Kirishima. Kaken delivered a huge explosion, a few seconds of black smoke restricting the vision of the class. Oh dear, that's dangerous. The man chuckled. The smoke cleared up, and the man appeared unharmed. Immediately, Kaken and Kirishima's confidence withered. It was going to take more than a few aggressive blows to defeat the man associated with the love. Move aside, you two, 13 commanded, her finger still pointed ready to take action. My job is to scatter you all and torture you to death. The villain yelled menacingly. He surrounded the students attacking them with strong winds. What they? Kirishima grunted, holding back the strong winds that were emitting. The students unsuccessfully fought against the strong gashes of wind. Portals began opening up, launching the pupils into random parts of the training ground. Unfortunately, the class broke apart. Oddly enough, the villain's quirk seemed to have an effect on Izuku. In an instant, Deku teleported right in front of all the action, where Aizawa was easily beating these amateurs up. Oh no. No, no, no. This is bad. Izuku muttered to himself, stepping backwards. He turned around only to jolt back when he made eye contact with one of the villains right in front of him. Out of all the years he's been dead, not a single living thing has made eye contact with him. Izuku froze in shock, maintaining eye contact. The villain smirked, leaning towards his ear. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost, dear." He giggled. Izuku stood there with his jaw wide open. "You can. How about I'm dead," Izuku blurted out loud. Disregarding Izuku's question, the villain straightened up, extending his arm out. A glowing yellow orb released from the palm of his hand. "You see that hero there? Well, he's already beaten half of us." He carefully touched Deku's shoulder. "Lend us a hand, yay?" The grip on Izuku tightened as he aggressively shoved Izuku back into his physical body. Izuku fell on his bottom from shock. Seconds passed, his ears ringing like church bells. Adrenaline pumped throughout him. He quickly stumbled to his feet, searching the area for the villain who was nowhere to be seen. He retreated back, stumbling with each step, like a newborn learning how to walk. He began to run away from the chaos. Heart pumping, beating, pushing blood into his veins, he stumbled upon rubble, hiding behind it. He let himself fall, scraping his knees, and for the first time in forever he felt pain. He examined his knees, blood seeping through the pair of clothes he last wore when he stopped breathing. The world had stopped for him, only to return just like he left it, bloody and sore. Izuku put his hands in front of him. Hyperventilating, he quickly slapped himself in the face. It stung. It stung. He let out a shaky breath, touching his face, reaching for his hair, quickly yanking it, pinching his arm, biting his finger, poking his eye. No matter how much pain he felt, he couldn't believe that this was all happening. Plip, plip, plip. Tears streamed down the gentle boy's face, each tear washing away his stained cheeks. He sobbed, unable to hold back tears. He cried like we was being held by his mother the day he was born. Cried as he stood on the ledge of that damn building. Izuku has resurrected. After an eternity of tears, Izuku wiped the snot of his face, smearing the blood even more than it already was. He staggered up cautiously, peeking towards Aizawa, making sure to not be seen by anyone. He grimaced, looking at the injuries on the poor hobo. Things were getting nasty. The pro-hero had already beaten the rest of the villains that were having a go at him. Now it was just him and Shigaraki, and some brain-dead next to him having a serious standoff. At any moment the two could rip each other's eyes out. Izuku safely hid behind the rubble again, pondering what to do next. It's not like he could just walk away in this situation, or even begin to explain to anyone that he rose from the dead and that he doesn't affiliate with the villains. As much as he wanted to, he knew that he was too weak to go out and fight alongside the hero. Helping the students was out of the window too. What if he were to stumble into Kaken? Or worse, what if he were to die again? _Tenya Iida Pav. I gave a reassuring pat on the back to my fellow classmate, assuring that everything will be okay. All Might ought to be here soon, I'm sure of it. However, my face said otherwise. After we had gotten separated throughout us, I made it a priority to reunite us. A little over than half of the class, including me, were hiding behind huge wrecked buildings. I bit my lip, wondering what to do next. Katsuki, Kirishima, Tsu, Ajiro, Sato, Aoyama, Mina, Takoyami, and Mainta were among the few we couldn't find. Wiping the sweat off my brow did no good for me either. If anything, I looked like I was having a silent panic attack. Shame on me, especially with the title as class president. I wasn't fit for such a role. "You okay, bro?" Denki placed his hand on my shoulder. I rapidly blinked into focus. Yay, just thinking about our next move. I trailed off into a series of mumbles. "Don't stress it. I'm sure the pros got it under control." Siro smiled. I gave a quick nod, quickly returning to a state of panic. Momo jolted upright, walking towards me. "Tenya, your quirk, you're fast, right?" she asked. "Yay." I crossed my arms. "Then run," she uttered. "What?" I looked at her like if she was insane. She pointed towards the entrance. "It's risky, but what more can be done?" Hagakure stepped in. "Right, the school's not aware of any of this. The sensors didn't go off at all. The eyes of fellow classmates were glued onto me. You need to run to UA and get help. Come on, I can't abandon you guys. I'm the class pres. I began to stutter. This is exactly why you need to go, man, Denki blurted. Momo pointed towards the entrance, shifting everyone's attention. Look, 13 is distracting the guy. She looked at me with confidence. What's a cloud of mist gonna do? I let out a deep breath. Okay, I'll do it. A few sighs of relief were let out. Izuku Pav. I must have been out of it muttering to myself because I snapped back to reality in a flash. Speaking of flash, I spotted Tenya tearing straight through the doors of the entrance, dodging the villain's attempt to stop him. A grin spread across my face. He did it. He's gonna get help. Izuku Pav flashback. I used to be so scared of dying. Due to my nature of being clumsy, I worried that one day I might tumble to my death. How ironic. I balanced on the ledge. The only thing keeping me from plummeting to my death was the quietness. It completely hushed my train of thought. I took in a huge breath of cold, crisp air. And for the tiniest second I felt sane. I let go. And I fell, the violent winds whipping around my moppy air. I spread my limbs like a bird in flight, squeezing my eyes shut and confidently diving in. I had no regrets, not in the moment. I felt free. I felt okay. Crack. I have no idea if that was the concrete or my skull, but I felt everything at once, then nothing at all. It was almost painless. I was nothing but a mere splatter on the sidewalk. Brains scattered like an art piece meant to be interpreted with meaning. Only I had no meaning. There was nothing left for me. I just hope that you can begin to forgive me. I didn't mean to burden you, mother. Tenya Iida Pav. My heart was thumping, beating, begging to rip out of my chest. I practically burst through the teacher's lounge room of UA. I figured that's where most teachers would be around this time. I looked around to find teachers buried in paperwork. That's when I saw him. He looked like All Might, but skinnier and pale. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. A few teachers scurried to escort the skinny man. A teacher approached me, fuming, literally. Young man, how dare you burst in? These are restricted areas, the teacher barked. I fumbled with my words, trying to find the ones that made sense. You? What's your name? Teacher Sekijiro's smooth, deep voice echoed. The teachers were glaring, expecting me to explain myself. I was panicking on the inside, and all that I could do was stutter and shuffle around. Aren't you Aizawa's kid? You're supposed to be training at USG? Yes, I blurted out. Excuse me? I'm sorry, it's that I'm a bit nervous and my chest tightened. My classmates depend on me the most right now, and here I am panicking. Pathetic. The villains have infiltrated Asujian plan to kill All Might. For a brief second, I felt the weight magically disappear off my shoulders. A few glances were exchanged, and soon enough the teachers had no second to spare. I saw what true heroes were. Helpful and quick. The heroes began orbiting around me in chaos. Paperwork fluttering. Heroes making phone calls left and right. Military troops were being deployed. Heroes making themselves responsible for their students, scheduling substitutes. This is what it meant to be a hero. I opened my eyes today, and from now on I will promise to make myself useful. Come on, boy, explain everything in detail. Sekijiro gripped my shoulders tight. Yes, sir, I straightened up. Help is on the way. Please wait a little longer, one-eh. Katsuki Pav. I stomped past the rubble, followed by Shitty Hair, looking behind his shoulder in paranoia. Do you think we're being watched? He leaned forward, whispering in my ear. I swatted him away like a fly, visibly annoyed and pressured already. Kirishima was basically glued onto me like a small, defenseless child. So much for being so manly. Where are we going? Kirishima once again leaned into me. His hot breath ran down my neck. I spun around, shoving him. I'm trying to find wherever the hell we came from. I hissed, throwing my finger in his face. And you're just following me around like some scared little twerp. I continued to walk forward, only this time Kirishima wasn't following. He stood there glaring at me. "You're such an insensitive prick. You know that, right? What the hell you'd say to me?" I whipped around to find myself yelling at a cloud of dust. He'd gone off on his own path as I stood on my own, just like how it's always been, left behind with my explosive tendencies. I let out a yell in frustration. "Fine, F off." I stormed away. Izuku Pav. I began to move around the rubble, avoiding spots where I could be spotted in plain sight. I sprinted, feeling the weight of my body with every step. It was a feeling that was long gone and forgotten. Only this time I remembered, and I could feel it. This was enough proof that I am living and breathing again. I had a million things racing in my head, and that's when I saw him. My heart skipped a beat, throwing me completely off rhythm. Not the bubbly kind of feeling either. It was a feeling I never forgot about. Raw fear. The spiky blonde stomped by. If I didn't know any better, I'd say something, or someone pissed him off. My shoulders fell, and my eyes followed as he walked further away. I could have said something, I should have, but I was always invisible to him, dead or not. "Don't move." A quavering voice spoke from behind. I froze in place. I felt like a criminal getting caught in the middle of a bank heist. "Raise your hands slowly." Whoever was behind me tried their best to sound intimidating. I slowly lifted my arms that were resting at my sides, bringing them behind my head as slowly and calmly as I could. "Arg, what now?" "What now?" I needed to say something, anything. And it's not what you think it is. I cleared my throat. The student from behind scoffed. "Turn around, you villain." Bold of them to assume I'd be a villain, but I did as I was told. I squeezed my eyes shut, slowly turning around. Silence. I contemplated opening my eyes, but when I finally did, the red spiky-haired boy stared back. He inspected me from top to bottom before opening his mouth. "Are we gonna fight now?" He positioned himself into a fighting stance, making intense eye contact. "What?" "No," I uttered before clasping my mouth shut. Kirishima furrowed his eyebrows. I removed my hands, trying to find the right words that won't tick him off. I don't want to fight with you," I whispered, awkwardly shuffling around. Kirishima relaxed his shoulders. "Why not?" He questioned me, almost in disbelief. I kept my head down. "I'm not with the bad guys." "Well, you certainly aren't with Wana either." He crossed his arms. I could feel myself getting sweaty. "How am I supposed to explain myself? If I told you the truth, you'd think I'm mental." I chuckled. A look of disapproval could be seen in Kirishima's face. Maybe now wasn't the time to be laughing. "All right, hit me. I've heard some crazy stuff before." He sighed, probably glad he didn't have to fight, putting down his manly act. "Really? You'll give me a chance to explain myself?" I let out a long sigh of relief. I had no plans of fighting him, and I'm glad he wasn't either. He nodded. I bit my lip, trying to think of the right way to say it. "I died," I said blatantly. Kirishima sarcastically nodded, almost wanting to laugh. "I'm serious," I yelped, trying to sound as convincing as possible. "Oh yay." He raised his brow. "How'd you die?" He thought he was playing along with my little lie. I stared at him nervously, glaring at me, waiting for my response. I hesitated for a second. "I'll give you a second to come up with a lie. No pressure." Kirishima flashed a bitchy smile. "Suicide." I lowered my voice. He stared for a few seconds before looking disgusted. "It is not something to joke about." He raised his arm to strike. "You're real messed up." He swung, leaving a burning sting on my cheek. I held my face in shock before glaring at him. "Don't believe me? Ask your little boyfriend Katsuki." I barked at him. "He's the one who suggested that I'd take a swan dive off the roof." He stumbled back, trying to process what just came out of my mouth. "You liar." He activated his quirk, pointing his fist at me. I had no time to react. This time he struck me in the stomach harder than before. I stumbled to my knees, coughing till my throat stung. I looked up to see a boy blinded by rage. He raised his hand to strike again, not a single thought behind his anger. This time he didn't punch me in the gut. He aimed for my head. My world became blurry and muffled. Kirishima's face switched the moment he realized what he did. A face full of regret was the last thing I saw before I was surrounded in black. I fell unconscious, laying on the cold, hard concrete. Kirishima Pav. "Oh no, what did I do?" I breathed, bending down, gripping the boy's shoulders, desperately trying to shake him awake. "I couldn't just leave him here. He said something about Katsuki, something I hope isn't true. I hope this dude's just playing some sick mind game. Maybe that's his quirk." I took a moment to stare at his bloody uniform. I'd just have to wait here until the heroes arrive, making sure he's under custody of the authorities. I fell on my butt, hanging my head down. I acted upon blind rage again. Perhaps Bakugo's habits are sticking on to me. Shigaraki chuckled, striding towards the limp body of the pro-hero. Aizawa wheezed, gripping his chest all while trying to stand up. "This is almost too easy, Eraserhead." Shigaraki knelt down, placing his hand on Aizawa's head. He left his pinky in the air, preventing his quirk from activating. "But you're not what I'm after," he snickered, running his finger on the edge of Aizawa's jawline. Stopping at the chin, he lifted his face, staring at his red, dry eyes. "Where is All Might, HM?" Aizawa stayed silent. Not a peep from the man despite his state. "Namu, his arm," Shigaraki ordered. The Namu pulled Aizawa's arm back. He let out a wail. "I can rip you apart for all I care," Shigaraki muttered. But the hero wouldn't budge. Not a single peep. 13 Pav. Help should have been on its way ages ago. I was starting to doubt if I could hold back any longer. "Don't resist, 13. The villain struck from the side, hitting a blind spot. I stumbled back, hitting the floor. Sirens could be heard in the distance. The villain perked his head up, backing away from the fight. He instantly teleported towards the man with baby blue hair. It seemed that he was the head of this villain organization. They exchanged a few words before the blue-haired man looked towards the entrance and nodded. Soon a portal opened up, allowing for them to escape, leaving the mass group of villains behind. They escaped. Pro-heroes marched through the entrance, springing into action. SWAT teams started their search throughout the terrains for all the scattered students. I sprinted towards Aizawa, who was being carried away in a stretcher with Chiyo following behind. "Is he going to be all right, Chiyo?" Chiyo turned around with an uncertain look in her face. "Let's hope he recovers well," was her only response. Not a positive answer nor a negative one. He was certainly in a critical state. _Momo Pav. Marching footsteps were heard in the distance. We listened with caution, fearing that villains were approaching. When we came face to face with suited people with AK-47s, we almost sighed in relief. Thank God the situation was under control, and thank God that Iida made it through those doors. We were escorted outside of USJ, evaluated for any injuries. We sat there for a while, double-checking that all the students were present. A man with a clipboard furrowed his eyebrows. "We're missing a student. Does anyone know the location of Eijiro Kirishima?" Some eyes glanced towards Bakugo, who looked pissed as always. "I don't know where that shithead went," Bakugo muttered. The man sighed, taking out his walkie-talkie. "We're short on a student. Circle around once more. Over." Static could be heard for a couple of seconds before a voice replied, "Got it. Over." Kirishima. The search party looked through the rubble. Momo and a few others volunteered to help. "Do ya think he might be under some rubble?" Mina walked beside Momo and Hagekir. Momo glanced at Mina. "I hope that's not the case." Hagekir agreed, speeding up her pace. They reached a path that split into two. The girls stopped. "I'll take the left path. You two go the opposite way," Momo said, not looking back once. She left the two girls alone. "All right, let's go, Mina." Hagekir began marching, shortly followed by Mina. They reached a mountain of concrete. "Let's search behind it just to make sure." The girls turned around and were met with the red-haired boy on his knees. Mina let a sigh escape from her mouth. She approached him, but as she got closer, she noticed a second figure on the ground, presumably unconscious. Kirishima whipped his head around, surprised to find the two girls standing there. "Everyone's looking for you. What happened?" Haikir peeked behind Kirishima's shoulder. I found him snooping around. I assumed he was a villain." Kirishima stood up, taking a quick glance at the boy before approaching the Mina. "Gosh, that must have been so scary." Haikir tiptoed around the body. "What happened?" Kirishima asked Mina. Help arrived, rescued the class, SWAT teams bringing as many villains into custody for interrogation. Kirishima began to walk away. "Where are you going? We can't just leave this villain here?" Mina turned around, crossing her arms. Haikir nodded. "Mina's right. What if he wakes up and escapes or something? We need to turn him into the authorities." Kirishima dropped his shoulders, nodding in agreement. "So, are you saying I'd have to carry him?" The girls shrugged. Kirishima sighed and walked towards the boy, slinging him over his shoulder. "Let's go." Kirishima's words strained. "Man, he's heavier than I'd thought he'd be." Mina chuckled. Kirishima and the girls approached a group of officers who were taking statements from the students. Mina talked to the sergeant, briefly exchanging words before the tall, bald man looked at Kirishima. The sergeant nodded and motioned Kirishima to come forward. "You can set the guy down. We'll get him into some cuffs." The sergeant reached for his cuffs and Kirishima set the mystery guy down. He was pushed to his side and handcuffed tightly by the man. Shortly after, two men took each arm and dragged him, walking by the group of students. The students watched as the guy's legs dragged by and his head hung. The most noticeable thing was his green hair, covered in crusty blood but still gleamed in the sun, a beautiful emerald green. Among the students stood Katsuki, whose eyes were basically popping out of his head, skin as pale as a vampire, watching as the greenette got dragged into a van with several other villains. Kirishima locked eyes with the spiked blonde and began to question everything he thought he knew about him. "He's the one who suggested that I'd take a swan dive off the roof," bounced back and forth inside his head. Maybe the way Bakugo reacted was all the proof he needed to prove that the strange boy was in fact telling the truth. Maybe Kirishima was overthinking this. "What you did was brave, boy." The sergeant patted Kirishima's back after hearing the story from Mina and Haikir. Kirishima stared blankly for a second before snapping himself out of his thoughts. "Oh, yay," was all that could pour out of the boy's mouth at that time. He was told to join the rest to take in his statement. He stood apart from the group, distant, lost in thought. His eyes focused on the one thing. "Katsuki, what kind of person were you before I met you?" Katsuki Pav. "If there's anything to be worried about, it certainly isn't that nerd. Actually, that's the last thing I'd be worried about. Because he's gone, dead, 6 feet under. There's not one day where that green-haired brat crosses my mind. So why now? Because of some stupid lookalike the cops dragged out." I watched the man push the lookalike to cuff him. My heart skipped a beat when I took a look at the clothes he was wearing. That damn middle school uniform. I felt the blood drain from my face. My eyes must have been playing tricks on me. That kind of shit happens to people who grieve, right? They start seeing the dead. Was I grieving? Did I even feel a hint of sadness or remorse? I shook that thought from my head. Of course I couldn't feel guilty. After all, he died by his own hands. Who knew what went through that weirdo's head? Nobody even talked to him. He was an outcast. All this thinking has me confused. I'd rather forget about it. We just got attacked by villains. Narration. People in news vans got here before the heroes did, and by the end of it all they had enough interviews to air it on national TV. I'd say that it made quite the headline. By this time the policemen left for the station. A lengthy process of statements awaited the already exhausted detectives. Piles of endless paperwork. As for the students, they were quickly and safely reunited with parents who were reasonably angry. A few threatened to sue the principal. A mandatory week vacation ensured the school enough time to bump up the security. and secret construction plans were set in motion. At least everyone turned out okay. Well, except for Aizawa. He's currently in an intensive care unit. A few days passed by since the half-assed attempt to finish off All Might. The League has since stayed put with no further plans. The distant sound of a television played in the background, a news channel, a reporter rambling about Astya's incident. Shigaraki pretended to dismiss the TV, but in reality his ears were hooked on what the reporter had to say. The hideout was a stuffy, dimly lit bar that reeked of cigarette and booze. They all sat there. The tension in the room only made it even worse. The reporter's words burned in the back of their minds. Kurogiri shut the TV off, slamming the remote on the countertop. Nobody said a peep. Toga fiddled with the juice in her hand. She hopped off the bar stool, throwing her coat on. "Where do you think you're going?" Shigaraki hung his head low on the bar stool. The man had a few too many to drink. He held a strong concoction in his hand, gulping away at it. "It doesn't concern you." She turned the knob, ready to leave. Shigaraki slammed the glass on the floor, shattering it to pieces. Stumbling off the stool, he staggered towards the frightened teen. The sound of crunching glass after every step he took. "None of my concern," Shigaraki whispered, getting all up in her face. She scrunched up her nose at the smell of his breath. Shigaraki was pretty intimidating when he was sober, but he was wasted and reckless. Toga leaned away from him, only to have Shigaraki corner her. Her back was against the door. "If they catch one of us, they'll eventually find the rest of us." Shigaraki slurred his words, standing there for a few seconds before backing off to his little depressing corner of the bar. The only corner in which the flickering light bulb didn't reach. He sat in darkness. "Well, I'm not gonna sit here and mope around anymore. It's pathetic," she uttered before slamming the door behind her. Shigaraki didn't react this time. He looked up at Kurogiri. Kurogiri offered looks of pity and understanding. "Don't look at me like that," Shigaraki sighed, running his hand down his face. "Like what?" Kurogiri pretended to be oblivious. He wiped down an empty glass before putting it away. "You know what I'm talking about," he grunted. Kurogiri hummed, leaning against the countertop. He rested his chin on the palm of his hand. "Kurogiri." He looked up at Kurogiri curiously. "When we left the scene, what happened to the mob of villains we dragged with us?" Kurogiri thought about it for a few seconds. "The cops probably took them in, most likely collecting statements and whatnot. They stayed silent," Shigaraki grimaced. "You think they'll tell the cops anything?" Shigaraki buried his face in his hands. Kurogiri thought for a moment before opening his mouth. "Most of them are delinquents with petty criminal records." Kurogiri tapped on the marble. "Besides, who's gonna believe a stupid villain wannabe?" Kurogiri chuckled. Shigaraki nodded in agreement. That put his nerves at ease. At least he knows that he can't screw up any further than this. Izuku Pav. I woke up blinded by the selling lights, thinking I was seeing the holy light again. I jolted upright, only to find myself in a blank room, handcuffed to the table. I looked around and made eye contact with the face of a security camera mounted on the right side of the blank walls. Perhaps I was being monitored? Not long afterward, a man in uniform opened the door. He was chatting with a few of his coworkers before shutting the door completely. He approached the table and sat down on the opposite side of me. He let out a long, heavy sigh before raising the folder he held in his right hand. He examined me, squinting his eyes. "What's a kid like you wasting your youth on such a delinquent lifestyle?" He opened his folder and took out a pen. No, I stuttered. "What's your name, kid?" He looked up sternly, saying it so nonchalantly, almost like he said it for the millionth time this day. "Izuku Midoriya," I said, lifting my arms. I forgot they were handcuffed. He looked at me and then at a notepad, scribbling something down. "What's your association with the love?" He didn't take his eyes off of the notepad. Instead, he waited for a response. He tapped his pen on the pad, almost acting impatient. "I don't." "This is a mistake," I said, leaning back into the chair. He set his pen down, looking at me straight in the eyes. We made a mistake, he reiterated. Yes, I'm not a villain nor a delinquent. I nodded. But I'm assuming that you aren't a UA student either. He pinched the bridge of his nose. This guy was about to have a migraine, and I could sense that he didn't have the patience for this. Well, no, but I was interrupted. Then what was your business there? Again scribbling, then pausing to think for a moment, then scribbling some more. Well, I hesitated. Well? He waited for me to come up with some sort of reasonable answer. When he saw that I couldn't come up with one, he slammed his pen down. Listen, boy, I've been in this field way before you were born. I've dealt with plenty liars like you. So just get on with the truth so I can catch my lunch break, all right? I flinched. The man leaned back, fixing his composure. You want the truth? I said. Hurry on with it, kid. Izuku Pav. I'm tired of this nonsense. Get Tsukauchi in here right now. The man who was doing the interrogation stormed out of the door, slamming it shut. After what seemed of hours of trying to explain the truth, the policeman obviously thought I had been lying. I was not. In fact, I kept insisting so much that at one point he stopped acting professional. I was driving him crazy, but what more could I do? I sat in the room alone again, dozing off. I had been here for hours without food, water, or a bathroom. I blankly stared at the clock on the wall, listening to every tick, every second. I might drive myself insane. I don't blame the officer. It must have been another 30 or so minutes when I dozed off. The door reopened, and I abruptly woke up. This time a more well-kept gentleman in a beige coat walked in with a warming smile. He pulled his chair, comfortably settling down. He crossed his legs before flipping through a file that contained my picture. The previous officer informed me about the things you told him. He was soft-spoken and straight to the point. I looked at him and nodded. He looked back at me, inspecting me. Oh, yeah, you think I'm insane, right? I chuckled. The detective smiled once more. Not entirely. You see, I have a quirk that can detect lies. He waited to see my response, perhaps nervousness or hesitation. I just sat back and nodded. I didn't have anything to lie for. The detective knew this. Okay, let's begin with a few questions. Tilda. Tsukauchi Pav. True, true, and true. I checked off the notes I had collected while interrogating the young boy. I've come to find out his name is Midoriya, and all his claims about suicide were true. I sat in my desk in doubt, glancing at my monitor that displayed live footage of the interrogation room. The boy just sat there tapping his foot. I had to confirm my suspicions. I pulled up private records of the deceased on my monitor. I searched for the boy's name and paused on the enter button. I hesitated for a moment before hitting enter. Only 3 records came up on the system, and one matched his green hair. The boy had indeed been telling the truth. He was a puny little middle schooler with the face and voice of a high schooler. Somehow he aged when he was resurrected. How was this possible? I scrolled further to the contact information, just one phone number and a residential address. His mother's. Perhaps she could verify my disbeliefs even further. I abruptly stood up, racing back into the interrogation room. The boy looked at me. In the midst of silence, a large growl came from his stomach. He reddened, sheepishly smiling. Haven't had any food since I came back from the dead. He shrugged his shoulders. I'll get something arranged for you, but I need to make a few important phone calls. I headed out. The boy nodded. I basically zoomed through the office to my desk. I plopped down my chair, reaching for the phone, when a coworker stood behind me. So what's up with that mystery kid? You actually believe he rose from the dead? I held the phone to my ear, glancing up at my coworker with a promising look. That's what we're about to find out. I dialed the number displayed on the monitor. My coworker leaned in for a better listen. The phone rang a bit before going into voicemail. My coworker frowned, shaking her head. Good luck. She left the desk. I held the phone in disappointment. I called again, not wanting to give up. And again. I left a good amount of voicemails. An hour passed by with no luck. I tapped my foot, thinking of what to do next. What if I just call one last time? It definitely wouldn't hurt to try. Static from the other end. But this time a quiet woman's voice emerged. She sounded groggy, like she had just woken up. I looked at the time and it was past midnight, 3 a.m. Whoops. Hello? The woman spoke. I didn't hesitate to reply. Hello, is this Inko Midoriya? The line became silent before the woman spoke again. Yes, who is this? My face lit up. Miss Midoriya, I am Detective Tsukauchi from the police department. Sorry to call so late, but this matter is in regards to your son. The woman cleared her throat before answering. I'm sorry, there must be a mistake. My son has passed away. That's actually why I'm calling today. We need you to come down to the station as soon as possible. I gripped the phone in anticipation. I'm sorry, but is this about the allegations against his childhood friend? The woman seemed confused. No, actually it's something urgent, I replied calmly. Sir, it is 3 a.m. She breathed. Surely this matter could wait until a more convenient time. She sounded annoyed. I would be too. Miss Midoriya, I am about to tell you something that will sound insane. I thought of a way to put this lightly. What is this nonsense? She said. Your son is at the police station, in the interrogation room. I caught my breath. He's here. She scoffed. A spew of unintelligible words came from the other line before I spoke once more. This matter is urgent. You might want to come down to the station. With all due respect, sir, I saw my son's mutilated body at the morgue. Her tone changed. She was furious. I chose his casket. She paused. I planned his damn funeral. She went silent before speaking again. My son cannot possibly be alive, as much I wish he was. She hung up without a second thought. I sat there in defeat. I set the phone down and shut my eyes, thinking of what to do next. How could I convince this woman of the impossible? Visiting her home deemed to be too extreme. I pondered for a bit until a bulb lit in my mind. This Izuku kid should know exactly what to say to convince his mother. It was only a matter of getting the two to communicate. I couldn't just bring a phone in, perhaps something that could record his voice. A tape recorder, a pre-recorded message would work perfectly. Bingo. I rummaged through my cabinets when I pulled out just what I needed. I raced my way back to the boy. When I entered, he was humming some sort of tune. His face lit up upon my appearance. You're back. I was starting to get a little bored here. He added. Little is a bit of an understatement. He gave me a weary smile. I apologize, but I was trying to get in contact with your mother. The boy's eyes widened. Oh my God, he whispered to himself. What did you tell her? He said loud enough for me to hear. The truth, of course, but she was very skeptical. She eventually hung up on me. I sat down, lifting the tape recorder. Maybe she'd believe it more if she heard it from you. The boy sat there in doubt, looking at the recorder, then back at me. What am I supposed to say? He slumped back. Hey, remember me? It's your son, the one who jumped off that really high building on purpose, he said sarcastically. I'm back. This time his voice cracked. He choked back tears. Try saying something really specific the two of you would understand, kid. I passed him the device and he held it for a moment looking at it. Yay, I'll do that, he muttered, clicking the record button. Izuku Pav. I clicked the play button, ready to babble about a million things. But it couldn't be about something absolutely random. It had to be a quick message. I took a deep breath in, letting it out with a sigh. Mom, it's me. I'm alive. I let out in a shaky breath. I've been in the afterlife. I began to quiver. I was at peace. I wasn't in any pain. I cleared my throat. But miracles happen. I need to explain it to you in person, please. I hovered my finger over the pause button. I love you. Click. Underscore Tsukauchi Pav. You okay, kid? He sat there with his head hung low for a couple of moments before I grabbed the tape recorder. This isn't enough. He looked up, sobbing. What? I took the recorder and pressed play, listening to his voice speak over and over. This is perfect. She'll be in the station in no time. I tried to reassure him, but he wasn't convinced. How long do you plan on keeping me in this boring room? He asked. I thought about it for a moment. Not long, I promise. I stood up. I'm not an accomplice. I am not a villain. He tried getting up, but was restrained with the cuffs bolted to the table. No, you are not, I assure you. You will not be charged with any crime. I walked towards the door, grabbing the doorknob. Then why am I still cuffed? Why am I still here? He snapped back. I looked back. His face was flushed with red. He was sweaty and scared. I suppose that you are correct. I took the keys out of my coat and went over to him. His cuffs clicked loose, and he looked at me, rubbing his wrists. They were marked red. But I also noticed that he had scarring. Some were fresh, some were old, others were healing. I sighed, feeling sympathy for the boy. I don't think this is enough evidence to show your mother, I said, reaching my hand out. We need to pay her a visit now. His eyes lit up, taking my hand. I escorted him out to the lobby. It was early in the morning, but it was filled with silly delinquents and worried parents. You certainly know where you live, right? The boy nodded, and we headed out the entrance. _Izuku Pav. I stood outside the steps of the police station. The crisp, cold air whipped around, sending shivers down. I shuddered. Today was a rainy day. The sky was dark. I let a breath in, fresh, wet dirt. The windows were lit up from the light inside, illuminating the few steps ahead into the parking lot. I remember this city from childhood. This police station was in a busy area of the city, where the cars always honked, but everything was silent. I hadn't noticed that the detective was already at his car ready. The detective pulled out his car keys. I walked to the passenger seat and buckled in. Ready. Katsuki Pav. I haven't been able to shut my eyes ever since that day. I've been in bed all night just thinking. Just remembering that day. I saw the way he fell from stories high. The way he spread out his arms. A swan dive. The moment when he was inches away from inevitable death. I squeezed my eyes shut. Crack. The unnatural sound of 1,000 bones cracking at the same time. Students were gasping. They were screaming, running. I only opened my eyes for a split second. The way his body laid in a twisted position. The pools of blood slowly seeping through the cracks of concrete. His eyes wide open. The image was permanently burned into my mind. A reminder of what I caused. I couldn't bear to attend the funeral. Mom comforted me. But it wasn't me that needed the comfort. Inko visited often after that. She was all alone. And she looked like a mess. She always had dark circles under her eyes. She's the one that needed comforting, and my mom happily invited her over. Months eventually passed. I stopped having night terrors. I stopped seeing his twisted limbs in my dreams. I stopped blaming myself. I went on with my life. I went to UA. I made friends. I almost forgot about that stupid nerd. Almost. Izuku Pav. I watched the trees as we sped past them, blinded by the sunrise in between the tall buildings that surrounded Musutafu. So, what's your story, kid? Tsukauchi spoke up, eyes still on the road. I looked away from the window to face him. My story? I looked at my lap, fiddling with my sleeves. Yay, you know, what was your life like before? He paused, thinking of whether to finish his sentence. I let my eyelids shut, picturing what my life was. The good, the bad, happy memories, sad ones too. I got diagnosed quirkless at a young age, I began to say. The detective hummed in response. It was hard for my mother since my father was out of the picture. I obviously got bullied for being quirkless, especially by my own childhood friend. I shifted in the seat. We stopped at a red light. Tsukauchi took his eyes off the road and glanced at me. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I didn't know how to respond. I just nodded in silence. He pulled up to the curb where he parked the car. He leaned in to look at the tall apartment building. Is this it? He said, looking at the old building. The stairs were rusty and the paint had peeled. But this was home for me, right on the 3rd floor. Yup. I said. Tsukauchi got out of the car. I followed him out, and we stood in front. Lead the way, kid. I awkwardly nodded, heading towards the flight of stairs. Between each step, I could feel my heart thumping. We reached the second floor, and I abruptly stopped. Everything okay? The detective placed his hand on my shoulder. No, yay. Everything's fine. He pat my back, and we reached the third floor. We stood in front of a green door, apartment 337. I stood aside and watched as the detective raised his hand to knock. Knock, knock, knock. I stayed hidden from view, scared of what would happen next. The lock started to move, and the knob rattled open. Hello? Tsukauchi Pav. The knob twisted, and I was met with a short, stubby woman. She wore a sleeping robe, and her hair was tied in a bun. Izuku resembled Inko very much. Izuku looked at me with nervousness. He stood a few steps back away from view. Inko Midoriya? I asked. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to adjust to the rays of sun. Sorry, I must have woken you up. I'm sorry. Who are you? She said, finally making eye contact with me. I gave her a slight smile. Detective Tsukauchi. She cut me off. Her face changed from confusion to realization. You're that detective, the one that kept calling, she said, pointing at me, like if she were accusing me of something. You were talking all that nonsense over the phone. She furrowed her eyebrows. Unbelievable. I truly apologize, but I wasn't talking nonsense, I said, hand over heart. I watched as Inko reached for her cell phone, dialing 911. Nobody, Pav. Izuku stood frozen, listening from a distance. Tsukauchi motioned him further. That's when he took a step forward and stood on the doormat in front of the doorway. I can't believe you have the audacity to show you. Inko was looking down at her cell phone before she caught a glance of a second pair of legs. Her son's legs. She quickly glanced up, only she wasn't looking at the detective anymore. She was met with the same green pair of eyes that she recognized immediately. She gasped, dropping the cell phone, bringing a hand to her mouth. The freckled face, the messy bed head, his favorite pair of red shoes, it was all there right in front of her. It was him. A single tear fell from her eye. Izuku wiped his tears away. He turned to face her and smiled. Mom, he whispered under his breath. He stepped inside, towards her. Inko wrapped her arms around him, face still in shock. She hugged tightly, fearing that if she let go he would disappear again. Izuku buried his face into his mother's chest. How? She looked at the detective in disbelief. She gently cupped Izuku's face into her hands. She worryingly scanned his face. Izuku? Her hand trembled, and she felt weak in her knees. Izuku nodded, giving her a sad smile. It's me, Mom. I'm here. How is that possible? I saw your body. There was a funeral, she said, caressing his face. Shall we take a seat? The detective stood outside awkwardly. Ah, yes. Come in, Inko said, shutting the door behind them. She led them into the living room couch, where Inko sat next to Izuku, holding onto his hand tightly, still shaking from shock. I apologize for earlier. Inko quickly apologized. The detective laughed nervously. It wasn't your fault, he reassured her. I'm sure you've heard the news by now on the infiltration of us, he began to explain. Inko stayed silent, only nodded. Well, would you like to explain a bit further, Izuku? Izuku raised his head up and opened his mouth. Ah, yay. Inko sat on the couch, staring off into space. Izuku sat there waiting for a response. He had told her the whole story, from start to finish. Still, she couldn't comprehend the concept of the afterlife. The detective was there to back up the events that Izuku mentioned. So, you were a ghost? She said, still staring off into space. Izuku nodded, looking at her puffy eyes. You were here the whole time? She said, watching over us. Inko faced Izuku, who looked exhausted. Basically, yay. Izuku shrugged. The detective just sat there with a cup of tea. And you were following Katsuki around? She asked again. Izuku let out a combination of a laugh and a sigh. Yay, it can get pretty boring being a ghost. Inko chuckled a little bit. Everything went quiet. Inko opened her mouth, then closed it. She hesitated to ask more questions. "Did it hurt?" she said quietly. Izuku scrunched up his face and smiled. Only for a second. He grabbed his mother's hands, "I promise." "Okay?" She nodded. More silence continued before the detective took out a business card. He handed the card to Inko and stood up. "I ought to get going, but if you ever need to contact me." Inko and Izuku escorted the detective to the front door. "Oh, and Izuku," Tsukauchi turned around, "I hope to see you around. I'd like to keep tabs on you," he said, giving Izuku a handshake. Izuku nodded. "This is a first in my career as a detective." He stepped outside. He waved goodbye and walked off. Izuku turned to Inko and they just hugged. They stood in silence for a couple of minutes before Izuku broke the silence. "I really missed you," he whispered, "and your home-cooked food." They broke down into laughter. "Let's get you cleaned up. How about some new clothes?" "I'd like that a lot." Inko paw of time skipped 9:39 p.m. I stood in the doorway watching Izu rest comfortably in his childhood bedroom, watching as his chest rose and fell again, breathing calmly. I felt like I was going to explode. My son had just come back from the dead. And all thanks to some miracle quirk. I had to tell somebody. I paced to the home phone and dialed Mitsuki. The phone rang for a while before she picked up. "Inko, hey, what's up?" she said, followed by explosions in the background. "Sorry for the noises, Katsuki." She chuckled. "I don't mind, Mitsuki," I replied. "So how are you doing? Everything good?" Mitsuki said, followed by more explosions in the background. "Hold on, give me a sec." It went quiet for a second before Mitsuki and Katsuki broke out in a screaming match. "And go to your room." Then silence. I stood there dumbfounded. Mitsuki returned to the phone. "Anyways, Inko, how's everything?" She was just an angry woman not too long ago. Hearing her switch to her instant nice voice made me chuckle. "Mitsuki, I need to tell you something," I said carefully and quietly, making sure not to wake up Izuku. "You can tell me anything. What's up?" Mitsuki said more seriously. "Wait, oh my God, are you sick?" she immediately said. No, I'm fine," I said. Mitsuki sighed in relief. "It's about Izuku." Silence filled the room, on both ends. "Mitsuki." I checked if she was still there. She cleared her throat. "Are you having those horrible nightmares again? Do you need me to come over?" She lowered her voice. "No, Mitsuki, Izuku's here. I can see him. I can feel him," I said like a crazy woman. "Hun, I think it's one of those hallucinations again," Mitsuki said. In the background I heard tingling keys. "It's for real this time, Mitsuki. He's alive," I said, trying my best to convince her. "Inko, I'm worried about you these days. I'm coming over." I heard a car engine start. "Mitsuki, I'm being 100% serious," I said, fiddling with the phone cord. "Okay, but I'm still coming over." She said, "I care and I worry about you." "Okay, I'll see you soon." I hung up and put the phone back. _Katsuki Pav. I stormed out of my room into the kitchen where I saw the old hag put her shoes on. She was talking on the phone as she grabbed her keys from her purse. She slammed the door shut. I looked at my old man Masaru, who just gave me a glance and continued reading the newspaper. "What's up with the old hag?" I said, grabbing milk and chugging it straight from the jug. Masaru looked at me and set his paper down. "Inko isn't doing well these days. Mitsuki is worried." "Oh." I put the jug away and went upstairs to my room. I flopped on the bed and pulled out my vibrating phone. I unlocked it and opened a group chat. It was Class 1 ascending memes and chatting. I opened the chat. I sighed and shut my phone off. I sat up and looked at the clock. 9:50 p.m. I wasn't going to get any sleep anytime soon, so I got up and put some shoes on. I walked downstairs and opened the front door. "I strongly advise you to stay inside for security measures," For you know, the Usch incident, my old man muttered from across the kitchen. I rolled my eyes at him. Don't try and stop me, old man. I slammed the door behind me. I opened the fence and started walking to the neighborhood park. I breathed in the cold, crisp air. The walk took no longer than 5 minutes. I reached the old sandbox I used to play a lot in as a kid. I thought back to those times, laughter, smiles, in Deku, except he wasn't laughing or smiling. He was teary-eyed and terrified. Damn it, I kicked the sand. I'm such an asshole. All the memories of Izuku, terrified, hurt, bruised. Maybe I truly was to blame for his death. I came here to clear up my thoughts, but it only amplified them. They whirled around my brain, tormenting me. Every burn, every blast, every insult, it all came crashing down at once. I was the cause. And now he's gone because of me. Knock, knock, knock. A knock came from the door. Inko, who was still carefully watching over Izuku, paced through the hallway. She opened the door to find a very worried Mitsuki at the door. She stepped in and hugged Inko. I know this is hard for you. Inko hugged her back in confusion. It's the whole grief process. I understand that, and... No, Mitsuki. Inko pulled back from the hug. Inko gave her a smile of hope. Mitsuki stood in silence. Suddenly Inko walked to Izuku's doorway and looked inside. She smiled. Mitsuki furrowed her eyebrows and followed behind. He's here, she whispered. Mitsuki sighed and peeked in. She was preparing herself to see an empty room, frozen in time. But there he was, sleeping on his side. Mitsuki's face said it all. Her eyes basically bulged out of her sockets. Mouth hung open. She stuttered in shock, trying to put the words together. She looked back at Inko, who gave her an "I told you so" look. Holy shit, she whispered. How? How? Inko looked at Mitsuki with glossy eyes. It's a miracle. She smiled, then looked at Izuku. Mitsuki looked back at Inko and opened and closed her mouth in confusion. How? Inko invited her to the kitchen where she was preparing a tea. A detective came by today, Inko said while stirring honey into the hot beverage. Mitsuki took a teacup and served herself some. Turns out a resurrection quirk brung him back. Mitsuki set down her cup in surprise. Is that's possible? She whispered. Inko shrugged. I mean, we live in a world with quirks. Inko sipped her tea. Mitsuki dropped her gaze. Is he okay? Mitsuki asked. He ate, showered, and fell asleep instantly, Inko said, smiling. This must be exhausting for the both of you. Inko dryly chuckled and nodded. I think I'll spend the night watching him sleep, she sighed. I'm afraid he'll disappear again. Mitsuki patted her shoulder. I can spend the night. Please, you need rest. Inko set her cup down. Thank you. They both went for a hug. That's what friends are for, Mitsuki said. Masaru Pav. Katsuki? Masaru stood outside of the parked car. The headlights blinded Katsuki. He stood there with tears in his eyes. I told you not to come looking for me, Katsuki said with weakness in his voice. Masaru sighed and shut the driver's side of the car, walking towards him. Yea, well, Mitsuki's spending the night over. She'll choke me if she found out you went outside. Masaru directed him to the passenger's seat. Katsuki glared at him with puffy red eyes. He got in and slammed the door shut. Masaru got in and began driving. A silent awkwardness was in the atmosphere. Masaru looked at his son. Were you crying? He said, looking back at the road. No. Katsuki gave him the side-eye. Urke, were you smoking weed? He said, shrugging his shoulders, in his own way trying to get him to lighten up and get a few words out of the teen. Katsuki gave him an annoyed look. Sure, Katsuki replied sarcastically. Okay, Masaru chuckled. Morning 9:37 am. Izuku Pav. I groggily got up from the covers, looking around, adjusting my eyes. I was surrounded with All Might posters and figurines neatly lined up in shelves that had been collecting dust. I stumbled to the doorway and stuck my head out. I was able to catch a glance of the kitchen. and a familiar blonde standing there. Auntie Mitsuki. No way, I thought, walking through the hallway into the kitchen. Mitsuki must have heard my footsteps because she set down the pan she was holding. She looked towards me and shook her head in disbelief. I still can't believe it, she said, pulling he into a hug. I immediately hugged back, smiling. She pulled back and patted my bedhead. You're here, she whispered. And you're here, I said. She laughed, picking up a plate of freshly cooked eggs and handed them to me. Inko is still in bed. She's really exhausted, so I offered to stay over. She served 2 more plates. Anyways, eat up. She smiled. Thank you. I nodded and sat down at the table. Kaken, how's he doing? I asked, picking up the fork. Mitsuki had her back turned, but she tensed up at the question. That little brat? She awkwardly chuckled. Off to UA and whatnot. She shrugged. I shoved the eggs, swallowing hard. Inko came from around the corner and gave me a good morning kiss. Morning, Izu? She smiled, then looked at Mitsuki. Thank you so much for staying over. Mitsuki sat down, inviting Inko to breakfast. Inko sat down and picked up her fork. I haven't slept this good in so long. She laughed. Mitsuki joined in laughing too. I'm glad I'm here. She took a bite of her eggs. _Katsuki Pav. I laid in bed all morning, not sleeping, just thinking nonstop. I think and think so much so I'm sure it'll be the death of me. A soft knock came from the door. Go away. I say loud enough. I hear my old man sigh on the other side. I made waffles, he said, walking away. I ignored him and continued to mope around. I get a text from the old hag. I threw my phone aside and rolled over on the bed. Whatever, I thought. Tsukauchi Pav. It was an early morning. I set down my cup of coffee as I took a seat by my office. I reached for a file nearby and opened it. I rubbed my eye as I scanned the profile. I haven't gotten much sleep since I left Izuku with his mother, and to be quite honest, I couldn't resist the curiosity. So I began to investigate more, and below my eyes was Katsuki Bakugo's profile. An average high schooler with a great quirk. He seemed like the perfect candidate to pursue hero work. Or at least that's what he seemed on the outside. I flipped to the next pages where there were multiple minor incidents of violence and assault. His middle school records didn't make him look good either. Bullying students and disrespect for teachers. This kid was on a whole other level of rage. I looked at the bottom of the list promoting a suicide. This charge was later dropped, and for some reason it still showed up on record. I looked at his parents' profiles on my monitor. Their phone numbers were displayed. I decided to call the father. I picked up my office phone and dialed the digits. A few rings went by before I heard voices on the other end. Good morning, I said, listening for a response. Masaru Bakugo. Correct? Yes, good morning. Who's this? The other voice spoke in a quiet manner. Hello, I'm Detective Tsukauchi from MPD, I said in my best professional voice. A sigh came from the other end. Did my son do something again? No, sir, I just have a few questions, I said, chuckling nervously. Oh, good. I thought he disrupted the peace again. He laughed back. I awkwardly joined in. Sounds like it's happened a couple of times, I asked, hoping he'd tell me more. Yea, well, my wife is the one that knows everything, so you'd have to ask her the questions. Ah, I see. Thank you, though, I said as I grabbed a pen and wrote down her phone number that was in the database. No problem, sir. Good luck, he chuckled before hanging up. _Masaru Pav. I hung up chuckling. I set the phone down and resumed what I was doing. I picked up the cold waffles off the table and was about to dump them. Don't, Bakugo said, peeking around the corner. I raised an eyebrow. They're cold. I watched as Katsuki took the plate and set it in the microwave. Okay, enjoy then. I began to walk away. Katsuki mumbled something I could barely hear. What? I turned my head. He spoke up louder. Who were you calling? He said, mumbling louder. He stared at the microwave, watching the food rotate. Oh, just some detective. I shrugged and kept walking. Okay. He mumbled back as the microwave beeped. Izuku Pav. I sat at the edge of my bed and I could hear Mom and Mitsuki chatting in the living room. I went through a bag of my belongings that were sealed in an evidence bag. I'm guessing that these were my personal belongings found at the scene, that were returned to my mother. I took out my cell phone. The screen was busted and it had dents all over it. I frowned, flipping it over and staring at it for a few moments before I put it back into the bag. I looked at my old yellow school backpack. I grabbed it and dusted it off before opening it. I took out a burnt and damaged hero notebook. I flipped through the pages, smiling sadly at the poorly drawn heroes along with the long paragraphs of details. A loose page fell out and slowly fell in front of me. I reached for it and turned it around. I saw myself on it. A hero suit carefully crafted out for the day it would become reality. I stared at it for a couple of moments before cracking up. Man, that looks pretty stupid. I chuckled, folded the paper in half, and stuck it back into the notebook. I set it aside and went out to the hallway. Inko and Mitsuki were hugging goodbye. Mitsuki smiled at me while finishing her hug. Leaving? I asked, approaching the two. Yay, I'm afraid my house will be blown up by the time I get there, he said sarcastically. I laughed. She went in for a hug. She leaned into my ear and whispered something that made me freeze. You don't have to forgive him. She pulled back from the hug and headed for her car. I stood there probably looking stupid as Inko waved goodbye. I knew who she was referring to, and my reaction definitely let her know that I know who she was talking about. Kaken. Mitsuki had drove off, and Inko was looking back at me, raising her eyebrow. I was just standing there dumbfounded. Everything okay? She spoke softly. I blinked out of this trance and looked at her. Yay, good. I gave her a quick smile before walking into the kitchen for a glass of water. She followed me and leaned on the counter. She smiled at me, like if she had just come up with a plan. Want to go shopping? Get you a few new things? She said as she watched me gulp down the whole cup. I wiped my mouth, clearing my throat. Yay, that sounds good. I nodded. Her face lit up. Everything in that room reminds me of the past. I chuckled nervously. Yay, I understand that. She fiddled with the hair that was in front of my face. I miss spoiling you as a little kid. We both laughed. She grabbed her purse and her keys that were on the counter, and we were out the door. Mitsuki Pav. I came home to a quiet house. This was unusual. I set down my keys on the counter and traveled upstairs. I reached Katsuki's front door and knocked lightly. Katsuki? I said, pressing my ear on the door. I heard footsteps and the door swung open. Katsuki stared back, staying silent. What? He spoke up. No, nothing, I said. Just awfully quiet. I began to walk away when Katsuki's question made me freeze up. How was Auntie Inko? He said, leaning on the doorway. I slightly turned around and gave him an awkward smile. Fine, just fine. Katsuki squinted his eyes. What? I said, standing there. Nothing, he replied nonchalantly. I cleared my throat. Where's your father? In his study. I nodded and slowly made my way to the stairs. Thanks, I said halfway down. Okay, he mumbled back, closing his door shut. I walked down the downstairs hallway and entered Masaru's study. He sat in his chair holding papers and scribbling something on paper. He didn't notice me until I cleared my throat. Oh, you're back. Sorry, he said, fumbling with the stack of papers. He shoved them in a filing cabinet and looked up at me. How was Inko? He said. I opened my mouth but quickly stopped myself. I turned around and shut the door behind me, locking it. Masaru raised an eyebrow. I took a deep breath in preparing for what was about to come out of the mouth. Izuku's alive. I let a sharp breath out. There was no reaction. Instead, Masaru just sat there and blinked. He scrunched up his face, standing up from his desk. He walked towards me and gently rubbed my shoulders. Death is a complicated topic, he whispered, making eye contact with me. This was his way of indirectly telling me that I was insane. I sighed and threw his hands off me. I'm not crazy. I glared at him. He raised his hands away. I wasn't saying that you were, he said, backing up. A detective called asking for questions. You know more about that stuff, so, he shrugged. I furrowed my eyebrows. A detective? I mumbled to myself. I squinted my eyes before I realized something. My face lit up and I took my phone out. What? Masaru said, looking at me confused. I looked at him, bringing the phone to my face. It's about Izuku, I said, leaving the study. _Masaru Pav. Yes, hello? Mitsuki walked off while on the phone. I got lost in thought just standing there. Inko? Izuku? Alive? And a detective? The whole dead person coming back to life sounded impossible. But I know my wife. When she gets really serious, she's not taking things lightly. I shook my head and tried to get back to work. Izuku and Inko were walking towards their car in the parking lot of the city's mall. The sun was starting to set, displaying beautiful arrays of orange in the sky. They had spent the whole day on a shopping spree. But the most important part is that they were together. They hopped into the car, buckling in. Inko excitedly reached in the back seat and held a bag towards Izuku. What's this? He said. Slowly taking the bag from her hands, he opened it to find a box. Your other one is busted, so. Inko watched as he opened the box. A shiny black screen revealed Izuku's reflection. He turned to Inko, surprised. A phone, Inko said, making jazz hands. When did you? He took the device out of the box and held it in his hand. He looked like a child receiving gifts on Christmas morning. I have my tricks, she smiled as she started the car and backed out of the lot. And besides new phones, Izuku had a few new pairs of clothes. Thank you, Izuku smiled and turned the phone on. He watched the screen light up and a welcome page popped up. Inko ruffled his hair, smiling at him. Always, she said. _Mitsuki Pav. I hung up the phone with the detective in anger after yelling a series of profanities. I'm the type of person who would happily cooperate given the opportunity, but this detective was definitely out of his mind. Asking a series of ridiculous questions about my son. This detective really had some nerve. I saw the front door open and Masaru poked his head through. He gave me a quick smile and stepped out, closing the door behind him. He sank into the patio chair and raised his eyebrows. Do you think our child's a murderer? I said out of the blue, rubbing the bridge of my nose, hoping to stop an oncoming headache. My husband looked perplexed at the question. I don't think so, he said, unsure about his answer. I sighed. The detective, what did he say? I shook my head, confused. Stuff about Izuku he wanted me to confirm. Then he mentioned Katsuki, I mumbled, and dropped charges against him. I said, looking at Masaru straight in the eyes. He furrowed his eyebrows. Charges? Charges for what? Encouragement of suicide. We both went silent, staring at the floor. I know our son is dumb, but Masaru looked up in confusion. Those two grew up together. I don't get it. He stood up, leaving me to my thoughts. Before he went inside, I tapped on his arm. Don't tell Katsuki about anything, about Izuku. He nodded and headed back inside. I sank into the chair and sighed. A week later. Katsuki Pav, 7:45 m. 2 weeks of laying around doing nothing were over. UA welcomed all of their students to a safe and secure campus. I had my uniform on, sitting in the kitchen with the old hag and my old man adjacent from me. I shoved a fork full of eggs, staring at the two. Their movements looked stiff and carefully thought out, as if they were trying to avoid setting a time bomb off. This has been happening ever since my old hag returned from Inko's place. It was getting weird, and honestly, I was a little offended, trying to avoid pissing me off in the most obvious way ever. They kept avoiding eye contact with me. I finally decided to do something about it. I loudly dropped my fork, letting it clatter against the glass plate. Masaru stopped mid-sip from his coffee and quickly glared at me before setting his eyes back on the plate. The old hag stiffened even more, clearing her throat. "What the hell is up with you guys?" I said, watching as the two continued to eat normally, ignoring my question. I looked at my old hag, who abruptly stood up, grabbing her plate. I scoffed, looking towards my dad, who just gulped down the rest of his food. I stood up and stopped the old hag from walking away. She had no choice but to look at me and smile. But I knew down to the very core that wasn't a genuine smile. "Seriously, what's going on?" I raised my voice. I watched as my old man looked at Mitsuki, raising his eyebrows before standing up. "I'll be late for work," he said, grabbing the keys, heading to the garage. I turned back to Mitsuki, who just looked the other way. I rolled my eyes, giving up. I walked past her straight to the front door. Mitsuki followed behind, grabbing my shoulder. "There's nothing wrong," she said, fixing my collar of my uniform. I shooed her hand away, definitely not believing that bullshit. "I don't care. I'm clearly being left out of something, though," I said, stepping onto the porch. "I'm walking to school." I turned around and slung my backpack on. I slammed the door behind me. _Kirishima Pav. 7:52 am. The air was crisp and cold as I started entering the gates of UA. There were security personnel that were checking the IDs of students. Besides all these new security measures, everything was basically back to normal. I turned the corner, walking towards classroom 1A. But I hesitated, gripping the handle. I thought about my friends inside. But I also thought about Katsuki. After I stormed off at us, we stopped sending each other messages or talking at all. Last I saw him, he was pissed. I mean, he was always pissed, but never at me. I think I really messed up this time. Out of my peripheral vision, I saw a familiar figure starting at me. I turned around and I met with Denki's lovable dork face. "You all right, dude?" he said. I let go of the doorknob and smiled. "Yay, just excited to see you guys," I said. Denki smiled and reached for the door, opening it. He let me go through first. I walked inside to a classroom full of chatter. I got a few waves and hellos. I looked around for Aizawa, but it was just the students in here. I sat in my seat and leaned towards Siro, who was scrolling through his phone. "Hey, Kiri, you hear about the new dorms?" She showed me his phone, a picture of the newly constructed living area in the dorm. "So they weren't just rumors, huh?" I said. Siro nodded. "Where's Aizawa?" I said. Siro straightened up and leaned towards me, lowering his voice. "You didn't hear?" he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Hear what?" I said. "That fight with that villain left him seriously injured, man," he said, leaning back into his seat. I sat there perplexed. "Oh. We have a substitute, though," Siro said before hearing the door creak open. And that's when a spiky blonde walked in. He hung his head low and he looked like he was lost in thought, making his way to his desk, ignoring a few greetings. I stared at him the whole time before looking back at Siro. He raised an eyebrow. I looked at him with my face scrunched up. "What?" I said. "Nothing, man." He shrugged. Katsuki Pav. I made it in class just in time for the bell to ring. I walked in as students were settling down. All Might walked in with a stack of papers. I sat down at the desk, ignoring everyone. "I'm sure you've heard of the unfortunate news, students," he said, setting down the papers, facing the front of the classroom. "Aizawa is currently in the hospital. His injuries are being closely monitored." All Might stopped and cleared his throat. "He is expected to make a full recovery in a few months." The class sat silently, not knowing what to say. All Might broke the silence. On another note, UA has announced dorms on campus in order to improve security measures. The class broke out in small whispers. I watched as All Might grabbed the papers and passed them out to students. He stopped at my desk and set a sheet down. I grabbed it and read it as he went to the next desk. It read, "UA residential consent form, I skimmed over the paragraph all the way towards the bottom of the page. Parent's signature. It's best if this sheet gets signed by tomorrow because we'll be making arrangements for dorm tours and scheduling a time to move in your things. All Might said, lifting the sheet up before setting it down on the student's desk. He returned to the front of the classroom and grabbed out a whiteboard marker. It's been a complicated few weeks for us. They advised us to not resume training until things have settled. He turned around and wrote some notes on the board. Which means we'll have a few easy days of class, just assignments here and there. He turned around and gave the class a thumbs up. _4:36 p.m. Katsuki Pav. I walked home from school and I opened the front door where I saw the old hag handling groceries. She looked up at me and gave a quick smile. "You're back," she said, putting the milk away. "Yay," I said, reaching for my backpack and handing her the slip from earlier. She looked at me before slowly taking it. "What's this?" she said, darting her eyes on the page. I watched as she reached the bottom of the page and furrowed her eyebrows, confused. "Dorms? When is this happening?" she said, looking back at me. "Tomorrow." I shrugged. She raised her eyebrows in surprise. "They really want to get this done, huh?" I shrugged again. She grabbed a pen and set the paper on the counter, sloppily writing her name in cursive. "There." She set the pen down. I slowly reached for the paper. "Thanks," I said, going up the stairs. "Dinner's at 5. The old hag said. I slammed the door to my room. Izuku Pav. I had done nothing besides lay in bed all day and mess around with the settings of my new cell phone. I had managed to restore everything I had in my old busted cell phone. Contacts, pictures, even old music playlists. I went through my gallery, scrolling through the random photos, random screenshots from hero forums. It seemed really important to me at that time. I clicked on the photo and deleted it. No use for it now, I guess. I closed the gallery app and scrolled through my contacts. Only 3, Mom, Aunt Mitsuki, and Kaken. Mom had given me their numbers since she took up multiple jobs throughout the day and often didn't come home till 3 a.m. I'd walk to Mitsuki's house after school. Sometimes Kaken would be headed the same way, and we'd awkwardly walk together. Aunt Mitsuki would give me dinner boxes and send me back on my way home. That's how most days would go. I'd mostly spend my time at home doing homework, under a strict rule that I shouldn't go outside when Mom was out working. She worried a lot about making sure I was safe. I still went outside, though. Sometimes I leaned on the balcony exactly at sunset. I'd watch as the orangey skies set to a cool blue. Shivering as the cold fall breeze came in, I'd look down and watch the people below, like ants going about their way. "Izu?" Inko said, poking her head through the slightly closed door. I jumped, sitting up, turning my head towards her. "Dinner's ready," she said, opening the door a little before leaving. I threw my phone on the bed and sat up. I stretched my arms, letting out a small sigh. "Coming." I let a breath escape my mouth. I paced through the hallway, scratching my head. When I got to the kitchen, she had prepared steamed vegetables with salmon. I smiled and sat down. She placed a few pans in the sink before sitting down. I grabbed the fork and began eating, looking at the delicious food on my plate. She slowly grabbed her fork, poking at the food. I looked up from my plate, noticing that she looked disinterested at the plate. "Is everything okay?" I said in between chews. Mom nodded, still looking at her plate. "A bit full, that's all." She smiled, looking at me. She motioned me to keep eating. I picked at the salmon. "Izuku, I have work tomorrow," she said. I just nodded. "Means you gotta stay alone for a few hours." "I'll manage," I said, gulping down my food. I reached for the cup of water and washed down the rest. "Are you sure?" she said, avoiding eye contact. "Yay, I'm positive," I said, chuckling. "Why? You think I'm gonna—" I went quiet, and Mom did too. Mom cleared her throat and stood up, slowly picking up our plates. I sat there in silence. "You think I might try to jump again?" I asked. Mom had her back turned. She turned on the faucet, staying silent. I furrowed my eyebrows and I stood up. I opened my mouth to say something, but I stopped myself from doing so. I stood silently staring at her back as she washed the dishes. I walked to my room disappointed, shutting the door behind me. I let myself fall on the bed staring at the ceiling. I blinked a few times, my eyes going blurry with tears. Katsuki Pav, 7:45 p.m. I shoved my homework aside and stood up from my desk. I'll finish it later, maybe. I grabbed the dinner plates from earlier. I decided to eat in my room. The old hag had made things even more awkward. She swears nothing's wrong, and Masaru just follows along like a little puppy. That makes them both horrible liars. I headed down the hallway where the old hag sat on the couch. The TV was playing quietly. It was raining, and you could hear the pitter-patter of the rain hitting the roof. It was already that time of the year. She sat there with a cup of red wine. That was her idea of winding down on days like these. I never understood much of that middle-aged mom stuff. I put the plate in the sink, turning on the faucet. Little bits and pieces of the leftover food washed off. I didn't feel like washing it. I shut off the faucet and left it there. I turned to walk upstairs when I caught the old hag staring at me. "Wash your plate, please," she said, turning back to the TV. I continued to walk upstairs before she turned around again. "Katsuki, wash your plate." She set down her glass on the coffee table, slamming it a bit too hard. "I'll do it later," I said, continuing up the stairs. She stood up, standing in front of the stairs. "Katsuki," she said sternly. I turned around, looking at her. She stood there with her arms crossed silently. Fine, I'll wash the damn plate." I sighed, making my way down again. I slightly brushed past her. I felt her gaze behind my back for a few seconds before she went back to the living room. I rolled my eyes, scrubbing. _Izuku Pav. I felt bad for walking away. I also feel bad for leaving Mom alone all these years. And of course I regret my decision. I thought I made that pretty clear. I should apologize. I walked out into the living room looking for Mom. She wasn't on the couch, and much less in the kitchen. I turned around and towards her room. Her door was slightly open. I slowly peeked my head in. She sat on the edge of her bed. My eyes trailed to her hand. She was holding onto a piece of paper. I could hear her sniffing. Her eyes, puffy and red, met mine. She quickly folded the paper and stuffed it in her pocket. I opened the door, completely standing outside of the doorway. I just stood there trying to say something. Nothing came out. She quickly composed herself. I stood there until a wave of realization hit me. That paper was my note. The note I left her before I... "Is that my note?" I said in a little shock. Mom stayed silent. I choked back a little. "Why?" I whispered. She shrugged. "I'm still grieving," she said. I furrowed my eyebrows. "But I'm here now, right?" I said. She just stayed silent. I felt confused and offended. "Mom, all of that is in the past." She squeezed her eyes shut. Almost like she didn't want to listen to me. "I regret it, and I would never do it again," I said. She looked back at me. "You still jumped," she said, faint enough that I almost didn't catch it. Almost. I looked at her, hurt obviously. "What?" is all I could blurt out. "You're grieving for me when I'm right here," I said. "That's a little disturbing." I watched something in her eyes click. "Disturbing is having to see your body at the morgue." She snapped back. I couldn't say anything else. She opened her mouth again. "You were beyond unrecognizable, Izuku." We stared at each other silently before she spoke again. "A part of me died that day. Being brought to life won't magically make the trauma disappear." She wiped her eyes. I tensed up. Feeling teary-eyed, I stormed to my room. I felt hurt and confused. Without thinking much, I grabbed a jacket and my phone. I paced towards the front door, struggling to put my shoes on. When I finally did, I turned around. Mom was crying silently in the hallway. It pained me, but I couldn't be here. I had to clear up my head. I opened the door. Immediately a cold breeze ran through my body. The sky was dark, it was raining hard, but I stepped out, shutting the door behind me. I raced downstairs towards the sidewalk and just began walking. then walking turning into jogging. And soon enough I found myself running down the street, stomping on every puddle I ran through. I didn't stop. My lungs felt like they were burning. I went to the only place my mind could think of. Katsuki Pav. I put the clean plate on the drying rack and turned around. The old hag spared me a glance before returning to her TV show. She got a ping on her cell phone, ignoring it before it started pinging more. Messages came flooding in. Thin's time she looked down, unlocking her phone. A sense of urgency flushed over her face, immediately standing up, turning off the TV. "What's going on?" I ask, staring at her weirdly. She ignores my question, walking past me, snatching her purse. I turn to look at her, clearing my throat. She looks up. Something came up with Inko. She walked towards the front door, putting on her shoes. "Is she okay?" I asked, crossing my arms while leaning on the wall. The old hag scrunched up her face and sorta nodded yes and no. She opened the door and was about to step outside. "Can I come?" I asked. "No, you don't have to," she said, digging for her keys in her purse. "I want to," I said. She stopped and looked at me sarcastically. "Since when do you ever tag along?" "Since now," I snapped back. "Katsuki, just stay here. You have nothing to worry about," she continued, rummaging through her purse. I huffed, staring at her. "Nothing to worry about," I said, raising an eyebrow. Her phone still continued to ping constantly. She let out a sigh in frustration. "What is with your attitude? And where are my keys?" she said, raising her voice. "And what's with the secrecy lately?" I kept annoying her, hoping I'd get something out of her. She glared at me. "You better stop that right now." She lowered her voice at an attempt to sound serious. I uncrossed my arms, jingling the keys in front of her. She squeezed her eyes shut, letting out a deep sigh. "Give them to me," she demanded. My phone started ringing. I balled the keys into my fist and took out my phone with the other hand. I read the caller ID and almost shit my pants. I probably looked like a ghost because my mom's angry expression became worrisome. "What?" she said, leaning towards the phone. Her eyes read the text, realizing. She sighed, massaging her temples. I stood there confused, looking at the old hag. It was Deku. "How?" I said before she interrupted me. "He's alive," she said blatantly. "But I saw." "He came back to life," she reiterated. "When?" I said, staring straight into her eyes. "Last week." "Last week?" I shook my head, trying to process. "I wasn't planning on telling you," she replied coldly. "What? Why not?" I asked. She scoffed, not answering my question. I was still confused, but I was more pissed than confused. "Why not?" She stood silently, almost thinking of an explanation. "I don't know," she said quietly. "You don't know? Really?" I said, raising my voice. "Why the fuck would you not tell me about this?" I said, yelling at her. She yelled back in anger. "Don't you get it?" She furrowed her eyebrows. "Because you are the reason she covered her mouth before she could say any further." My face went blank and just nodded, walking past her, heading outside. "Katsuki, you're stupid. You did some things that," she said, lowering her voice. "And you think that I don't regret that?" I shrugged. "You don't think that every day I wish I could go back in time and stop myself from being such a dumb kid?" I grabbed my phone out of my pocket as I started walking on the sidewalk. I tried calling back, and it went straight to voicemail. "Where are you going?" the old hag yelled. I turned around, chucking the keys. They landed on the porch. I turned back around and started jogging. "I'm going to apologize." I ran down the street, having no sense of direction. I just went where my legs carried me. So, this was the end of part 1 of this series. Stay tuned for next part of this series, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Until next time.